Yes, again, my name is Sam Henderson, and I've been a lover and a student of history for many, many years, and it's been something that kind of is growing up. I was homeschooled growing up, and one of my things my family did was historical reenacting, and so it was something that we actually lived and did, and actually lived in the way they would have back in the day, and it kind of gives you a neat perspective. So something I very much enjoy, and it's a passion. And but in all that, it's an interesting thing to look at. What is good history, and first of all, why is history important? Well, history gives us a really neat perspective. Oftentimes, when you look at something happening, like a strange election cycle, or something happening of maybe some rioting or some political pressure in different ways, or maybe a scandal of sorts with a president, we often tend to feel like, and often people on both sides in news media tend to make it out to be the worst thing that ever happened. And while these are definitely interesting times in which to live, history gives us a really good perspective on how these things and all the things that we've been seeing around us have happened before. And it's interesting to see how those things played out. And then and also take some of those things and see early warning signs if something is going awry. So when I'm being interested in history, when I come across a really good history book, I wanted to share a little bit of that. And the interesting thing about the book that I just got through, and you can see a picture of it up there on the screen, is this book called Paul Revere's Ride by David Hatchet Fisher. Highly, highly recommend it. This is not just a book about, it gives a probably one of the best in-depth accounts of who Paul Revere was as a man. And I'll explain why that's important in a minute. But it also gives a very, very clear step-by-step, viewing things from pretty much all sides account of the battles of Lexington and Concord, and all the things that led up to that, and all the preparations on both sides before that, the organization of the British, the organization of the Patriots, and the very interesting things that went on behind the scenes, and who Paul Revere was. Paul Revere was a very, very interesting person. He didn't just ride out, and as many would think, he didn't actually ride out and shout, "The British are coming." A lot of people would say that's what he said. No, if you think about it, in his time and place, they would have all considered themselves to be British. He said that the regulars were coming. But interestingly, he didn't just go out and do that. That wasn't a unique little snippet of his life. He was a networker. He was one of those people, while not highly, highly educated, he was a person that networked with various liberty-minded groups. There were many groups that sprung up as England became more and more oppressive. But many of these groups were disjointed from each other. People had different views. We can even see that as we're talking about people with different views. We're a group here. Restore Minnesota's there. There's other political groups that have different goals and different things, even though we're all of very similar mind. And Paul Revere and actually Paul Revere and Dr. Warren, who's another patriot, were the only two that were on 5 out of the 7 or 8 groups. So he was involved in a bunch of these different groups, and he was able to connect people together. And that was one of his huge strengths that he brought to that beginning time of the American Revolution. So very interesting book, and I'll get into a little bit more. But the interesting thing that I found in this book is that, number one, this looks like a big book to go through, but it actually, this much of the book is all footnotes and appendixes. So it's very, very well researched. There's a whole section in here on how he based basically down to the minutes of what was going on during the battles of Lexington and Concord, and talking about timekeeping and all that. Kind of very, very detailed stuff. I didn't fully read that part, but very interesting things. But one of the parts that really stuck out to me, and I'm going to walk you through it tonight, is he lays out very clearly in this book how the legend of Paul Revere came to be, how his story, the account of what happened on that night, progressed throughout American history to today. And it's a very interesting thing, and it's an interesting cross-section of American history, of what happened, and also it's good for us to understand as we look at history. Okay, you have your original accounts, you have your original writings and firsthand view of what actually happened on a battlefield or in a situation. But then as we get further and further away, what happens to those accounts? How do those legends form? And legends aren't all bad. Every country has their legends, but it is a very interesting thing to see how that forms, how various movements, political, various things change, and that all in this we're just tracing it through the kind of the accounts of Paul Revere, as he is kind of an American icon, a little bit like kind of like apple pie or something very American. But it's an interesting thing to look through, and as we're doing this, keep in the back of your mind, this hasn't just happened with Paul Revere's account here. This has happened with a lot of history. So when you have when you get a history book, and it might be new, it might be old, but depending on how close it is to the original account, or how much they have drawn from those firsthand accounts, this may help you kind of have a little bit better of a filter to understand, is this history book as clear or even as honest about what actually happened. It's interesting. We look at history and we look at all these things through a lens, through our worldview, through what's going on right now, through the way we see the world. It's funny, you look back at Hollywood films and other things from years ago, and you see TV shows and other things that are portraying medieval times or portraying something in the backwoods, but then you're like, well, but yes, but some of the women in the portrayal have are kind of have maybe a Jackie Kennedy hairdo or something like that, and you look at it and you go, I can tell what time period this was done in, and you can tell from older media and those kind of things that they looked at history, but then they superimposed what they thought was the style of the day into that. So that happens throughout history, and so that's kind of an introduction, and we're just going to kind of roll through. I'm going to be reading some excerpts from this, and we're going to look at, as I said here, we're going to look at, there we go. I called it the 10 Paul Reveres, just kind of a name, but it's there's Paul Revere. That's kind of the best painting we have of him. He was a silversmith and a very interesting man. But so here we have, right after Paul Revere's Ride, here's the first kind of accounts of what happened. This is a portrayal that was printed. It was drawn by an Amos Doolittle, and this was right after the battles of Lexington and Concord happened. This particular picture, if you look carefully, look at what the colonial Minutemen are actually doing. They're actually falling back pretty heavily, putting up no fight, not firing back at all. This is something to take note of. The original Whig leadership, not only had they organized quite well behind the scenes and organized in a military sense and in a political sense, but they also understood how to, not necessarily, how public opinion really was important in something like this. One can look at that one way or the other, but it was a very important thing to them. And so one of the things that they particularly tried to paint this episode in history, and for them it was going on right then, as what was something that was very much the men coming out was just spontaneous. There wasn't really any organization around it. It was spontaneous. These guys showed up, and that they really wanted to portray the British as the aggressor, 100% the aggressor in this situation. We have another painting here, same time. You can see this is the British marching back, and you have men down here. They are firing from behind a stone wall. You have the colonial troops, but obviously the British are burning and destroying as they go. And we can see that at this early time, that was kind of a picture that they wanted to portray. Just briefly here from the book. So while the first accounts were being published, the Whig leaders themselves kept silent. Many had sworn a vow of secrecy about their activities and were guarded even in conversations with one another. One of their sons remembered that as late as the early 19th century, the stories of the signal lamps and the midnight ride was a common talk, was common talk at all my fathers, and they were often met. Though I can call to mind, they were careful of calling names, having some fear of liability. So they were very careful, very secretive about who these people were and what they were doing and who actually hung those lanterns up and why and all those things. It was still very close to them, and they didn't want somebody's name getting out there. Fear of liability was not the only factor. The silence of the Whigs also had another cause. The elaborate preparations they had laid before the midnight ride did not fit well with the Whig image of Lexington and Concord as an unprovoked attack upon an unresisting people. Here was the first of many myths that came to encrust the subject. The myth of the injured American innocence, which the Whigs themselves actively propagated as an instrument for their cause. So there was an intention of painting the British in a very poor light. General Gage in this situation turns out actually the Whig leaders, even to the point of getting their account back to England of what happened here with the battles of Lexington and Concord, they got it back to England before General Gage's account got back to England. And it very much turned the people of England, the general common people, definitely put them on the side of the colonials here. And it was very interesting that as they, that's one of the reasons that the British had real difficulty getting people to enlist from the British populace to go and fight this battle. They were very opposed to enslaving fellow Britons. And early on, this was considered a British Civil War. And so that's one of the reasons that the king goes and gets a lot of Hessian troops. And the Hessian troops are mercenary troops that come in and are a big part of the American Revolution. So that's kind of our first Paul Revere. It's interesting, but right out of the gate, they're being secretive about what happens for understandable reasons. But it's interesting. So here we have, this is a little bit later picture taken from that first picture I showed, and you can see some things different. You can see some guys are firing back. There's kind of a semblance of a line. Yes, they are falling back. This is on Lexington Green. The idea of that kind of the first shot or the first things that happen. So we have the children of those founders. And they take a little different turn with this story. The common talk made Paul Revere a local hero throughout New England. After the Revolution was over, his exploits began to be set down on paper, sometimes in highly inflated ways. The growth of his reputation as a regional folk hero was evident as early as 1795. To mark the 20th anniversary of the event, a Yankee poet who signed himself Ed Stiles, wrote a commemorative epic poem writing about the Midnight Ride. And he wrote talking about Paul Revere fording major rivers and riding a fast horse and all these other things. And not a lot of that was true. There was really no huge rivers to ford and all these great things. But he made him bigger than life, made him out to be quite a person, which was an interesting thing. And so it's interesting. They also started gathering a lot of eyewitness accounts at this time. Paul Revere had his own account written down, and various eyewitness accounts are written down. But it begins to the things turn a little bit, and the history of what happened in Lexington and Concord, what happened with Paul Revere, a little more starts coming out about the organization behind the scenes, the defense of their homes, instead of being just kind of passive people that just stood up at a moment's notice. Some of this stuff starts coming out, and the children of these patriots start really embellishing their exploits. So the next one we have, and most of you probably this comes to mind when we think about Paul Revere's Ride, is a poem by Longfellow. Interestingly, this poem comes out in 1861. If you at all know about history, what happens around 1861? Civil War. And this is an interesting thing, and we'll see this happen more than once, where Paul Revere's history and history in general kind of gets brought back up to fuel that patriotic fervor before when a war is taking place. Kind of interesting. So this happens. He puts this out there. The interesting thing is Longfellow's poem, while maybe fun to recite and has a fun rhyming lilt to it, is not a very good historic account of actually what happened. It's very poor history, and people were actually pretty upset about it. It's interesting. From a historiographical perspective, Longfellow's poem contained curious irony. He appeals to the evidence of history as a source of patriotic inspiration, but was utterly without scruples in his manipulation of a historic fact. As a historical description of Paul Revere's Ride, the poem was grossly, systematically, and deliberately inaccurate. Its many errors were not just careless mistakes. Longfellow did some research on the subject, and he did do some study, but he also took a lot of poetic license in the way that he put this account together. Not to say it was bad, but it was just something that he was being very poetic about it. It's interesting. It says also, as a work of history, that interpretation was widely inaccurate in all its major parts, but as an exercise in poetic imagination, it succeeded brilliantly. Longfellow's verses instantly transformed a regional folk hero, so Paul Revere was still just kind of a regional folk hero, into a national figure of high prominence. Paul Revere entered the pantheon of patriot heroes as a historical loner of a sort that Americans love to celebrate. From Captain John Smith to Charles Lindbergh, many American heroes have been remembered in that way as a solitary actor against the world. This was not merely an American phenomenon. It was an attitude that belonged to a time as well as a place. Many romantic writers in the late 19th century, Emerson, Carlyle, Nietzsche, celebrated historical leaders as heroic individuals who faced fate alone. So it's interesting that the even picture of what he's doing is changing. That he's a lone, one man changing the course of history, instead of what, if we study into it, he was a networker. He had built a network, and it was a group of men working together. But the story changes a little bit here, and so, but it's something that it fires up the country, fires up that patriotic fervor, and it's interesting. Part of, even though Longfellow was in error, it did encourage a lot of the people to actually double down and actually study what actually happened. So a lot of historical stuff was still written down and documented, because a lot of these little towns and people that had connections or family that were still, Paul Revere's families, other people were rather upset by Longfellow's poem, and they said, wait a minute, we want to write down what actually happened. So it may have been a bit of a negative from a historical sense. It was a good patriotic thing for the country, and it helped people write some things down a little more carefully. So interesting, but Longfellow is probably one of the biggest impacts on what people think about Paul Revere. Even as late as 1914, Thomas Edison made a silent film called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Like many autodidacts or self-taught people, Edison was deeply contemptuous of schools and scholars. This is what he had to say. I say, he wrote, that on average we only get about 2% efficiency out of school books as they are written today. The education of the future, as I see it, will be conducted through the medium of the motion picture, a visualized education, where it should be possible to obtain 100% efficiency. to the end, Thomas Edison, or to that end, Thomas Edison made a film of Paul Revere's Ride as a way of teaching American history through the camera. His interpretation closely followed Longfellow's poem in substance and detail. And so, yes, he was teaching history, but it was Longfellow's version, not the actual version of what happened. And interesting, him seeing the power of visual medium. And this isn't the only time that film comes into this. It's very interesting. So here we have Longfellow. So after that, we have kind of an American, it's kind of that end of the 1800s, and a real kind of a encouraging of that American spirit. America's growing. America's becoming a major world player, and they decide to make a monument of Paul Revere. They definitely made some mistakes here, and I'll read a little bit about that as they portray him a little bit, him and his horse a little more superhero-ish than he actually was. But so we go on from Longfellow to the probably, here's number 4, Paul Revere number 4, The Myths of Imperial America. Colonel Revere as a man on horseback. Thanks largely to Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's stature increased steadily during the late 19th century and spread throughout the United States. Towns were named after him, not merely in New England, but also in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Missouri. The centennial celebration of the American Revolution began in 1875, also inspired much popular interest in his life and work. Many celebrations were held. Paul Revere began to be given a new phenomenon, was through the more meaningful and different era of American history. During this period, he was commonly called Colonel Revere, a military title that came to him later in the War of Independence, and increasingly became a militant symbol of American strength, power, and martial courage. And yes, they actually in the city of Boston decided to make a monument of him. And this fellow here, E.T. Cyrus Dolan, he sculpted this. They loved it, even though instead of he kind of gave him a war horse that was kind of a war stallion there that he did not have, and kind of more of a military cut coat, which also he would not have had. But they liked it either way, and decided to have him go forward with this. And so there was this kind of continuing to inflate the legend of Paul Revere. We also see they make music about him. This is the Paul Revere March 2-step by one of the pop music people of their day. And so this was sheet music that you could have gotten, and this was kind of their entertainment of the day. And so you have all these things, and kind of a real patriotic fervor, making Paul Revere out to be this amazing American hero. And then things begin to change a little bit. We have a war that happens, World War I. Very interesting how things change, and wars kind of punctuated throughout there. So we see at the end of this, we have, and I was talking about another film. This is another film. Both of these films, I looked them up, Thomas Edison's and this one, you cannot find them anywhere. They are kind of lost to history, but they're both in the silent film era. This was an interesting one, though. And this, speaking of, censorship, nothing new. So this was a film that was put together by Robert Goldstein. It was called The Spirit of 76, and it had to do with Paul Revere and also the whole Revolutionary War time frame. He portrayed the British in a very, very poor light. Goldstein was a German Jewish man, and it was this film, on its first showing in Chicago, the federal government seized it, and they said that that it had some depictions of the British harassing and hurting the population, and because we had just gotten into a war on the side of Britain, they felt that that was a very poor thing. And so under the Espionage Act, they seized this thing. And Robert Goldstein says, "Hey, I'll re-edit it and whatever." And they say, "Okay, you better." But he didn't. And they played it in somewhere in California, and then he was taken up on charges, and he actually wound up going to prison over this thing because it didn't play well. And it is an interesting thing that we start to see a change in the way history is being portrayed at this time. A lot of people call it kind of an Anglophile, or people that are very pro-England in history. And this happens. There's a lot of very powerful people that are behind this, and trying to kind of join, see ourselves as brothers of England. England hadn't been our friend up until this point too much, but at this point things are going to change. And so the interesting thing, just wrapping up on this film, was, let me see if I can pull it up from. But yeah, he gets, and so it was actually an event called the Spirit U.S. versus the Spirit of '76, an interesting court case title. But yeah, Goldstein was charged in federal courts with violating the Espionage Act. The U.S. prosecutor argued that as the war effort demanded total Allied support, Goldstein's film was seditious on its face. Goldstein was convicted on the charges of attempting to incite riots and cause insubordination, disloyalty, and mutiny in the U.S. soldiers. And he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Implications were made throughout the trial that he was a German spy, though that wasn't true at all. The very sad part is, after he gets out of prison, he tries to revive his film career. He goes over to Europe, and as far as we can tell, Robert Goldstein probably died in a concentration camp. So kind of a dark end to that one, but interesting how censorship isn't all that new, but interesting. And he actually gets acquitted later on, and they say, no, pictures are part of free speech. It was, new technology comes out, and the government doesn't know what to do with it, so let's censor it. Interesting thing there. But back to that, talking about the Anglophile change, and that there really becomes a big push to have, and nothing against England or for England from my perspective, but it's interesting that becomes a push in how we see things. Now, there's a positive side of this. A lot of people go over to England and collect a lot of the English accounts of what happened in the Revolutionary War in their writings. But it is very interesting, and that we kind of wind up throwing in with the English during World War I, and kind of have been on their side ever since, and for many good reasons. But it is interesting that this begins that kind of a shift in the way we look at things. So after wars, especially wars like this, we often have a turn, almost like a bit of a national kind of a patriotic depression, so to speak. And so what happens after this, so we kind of talk about the Anglophiles, kind of bringing the English perspective in. So what we have is this is in the 20s and 30s, right after World War I. And we see kind of they call it here an age of disbelief. Age of disbelief, the myth of the American debunkers. This is a time when they start really tearing down these superhero characters that have been based. And it's interesting that happens. Interestingly, even amongst the various descendants, there's kind of some bantering back and forth. Paul Revere's descendants, and because Paul Revere wasn't a big fan of John Adams later on, after everything happened when John Adams was president, so they didn't really like each other, and so even their descendants kind of had some falling out. It's kind of interesting. But it's interesting here, this is Warren G. Harding, and by the point of 1923, in one exceptionally bold debunker went so far as to assert that the Midnight Ride never happened at all. At that point, the President of the United States felt compelled to intervene. Only a few days ago, Warren G. Harding declared with high indignation, an iconoclastic American, said that there never was a ride by Paul Revere. The president was shaky in his facts, but rock solid in the support of Paul Revere. Someone made the ride, he reasoned, and stirred the Minutemen in the colonies to fight the Battle of Lexington, which was the beginning of independence in the new republic in America. I love the story of Paul Revere, whether he wrote or not. So, so that's Warren G. Harding, not a stellar president if you look into him at all, but interesting that there's so much tearing down at this time, and there are some things that when things get built up so high, people start poking holes in it because he wasn't maybe as high as the pedestal they put him on, but we have kind of a swinging back. But what happens to bring things back? Well, we have another war, World War II, and we start to have a resurgence of patriotic fervor. But we start focusing on Paul Revere in a different light. We focus on him more at this time as the myth of the common man. The age of the debunkers ended abruptly with the outbreak of World War II. As fascist and communist dictatorships gained strength throughout the world, the free institutions were increasingly under violent attack. America began to think about their national heritage of liberty and liberal values and democratic purposes. And so, once again, Paul Revere's reputation was a sensitive indicator of cultural change. The reputation of the Midnight Rider began to be refurbished to meet the changing needs of a new generation. In 1940, the city of Boston finally got around to erecting that statue by Cyrus Dolan as equestrian statue. One might expect that the militant Paul Revere of Dolan's monument would have returned to fashion with the war. But something else happened. Paul Revere was studied, given a new image, different from all that had come before, and yet perfectly matched to the needs of the democratic crusade against fascism and militarism. The architect of this new interpretation was Esther Forbes, a New England novelist who turned her hand to writing history with high success. It was one of the most important and probable pairings of subject and author, a masculine figure whose life had been absorbed in the hurly-burly of politics, war, and business, and a New England spinster who worked beside her aged mother in a quiet alcove in American antiquarian society. In that setting, Esther Forbes wrote a book called Paul Revere and the World He Lived in. It was published in 1942, the year of Corregidor and Midway, and gave the Midnight Ride a new identity, suitable to a nation's great crusade for freedom and democracy. Esther Forbes interpreted her hero as an ordinary American, a peace-loving common man who rose to the challenge of great events. In a letter to the editor, she summarized her idea of Paul Revere in 2 sentences. He represents a typical and important type of man about which very little has been written. And she wrote, I mean the simple artisan. So they focus more on him being just this simple the common man, the everyman, and focusing more on that side of him, which is partially true, but it's interesting what they focused on. So we have that, and then it's a very interesting that we then start using him in a lot of branding, and this comes out of the Cold War. So we have the Cold War, and now we have different foes on the horizon. With the beginning of the Cold War, Paul Revere began to appear as the personification of a linkage between capitalism and democracy, the symbol of open, pluralist society on the free world. On the anniversary of the Rite in 1950, the Boston Herald warned that the tyranny of redcoats takes a new form, communism. In saluting the patriots of Concord and Lexington, we sound the alarm once again. The enemy is now in our midst. Much popular writing in the era stressed the connection between Paul Revere's activities as a son of liberty and his career as a businessman, and an archetype of free enterprise. The image of Paul Revere became increasingly prominent in commercial advertising. Paul Revere Insurance Company reached its public with the slogan, Revere is a name you can trust. The Revere Sugar Corporation used a silhouette of the Midnight Rider as an advertising logo. Revere Copper and Brass Company, which had grown from Paul Revere's business. He was a silver and copper smith, so this is actually still his business. Stamped a profile of its founder's head on the bottom of each copper-clad saucepan as it was sold by millions to American housewives. And so this is yet again another way in which Paul Revere wound up being used in to sell things, and also as a capitalist. That the capitalism was a wonderful thing, and the fight against communism. But again, we have another war, and this one causes a different change here, and we have kind of a lot of the tarnish of American patriotism, and that starts to really wear off with the age of Vietnam. So we have the age of Vietnam, the myth of evil America, and so we have a couple different accounts that come out. Various books talking about kind of debunking the myths and the ideas, and actually painting almost in a more and more negative light, and making up their own myths of things that didn't happen, but in a negative sense. This picture over here, that's Paul Revere, kind of a political cartoon, as it were, of him. And in this book, he writes. So this guy writes, he informed his readers that Paul Revere was a coward and a traitor, and sang like a canary to the British captors, and betrayed his friends to save his own skin. This interpretation was illustrated with a bizarre cartoon of Paul Revere as a canary chirping away in his cage. Bissell's account was grossly inaccurate and very opposite of what actually happened, but it was what some Americans wanted to hear about their heroes. There's a downturn. There's an interesting change there that happens because people were struggling with what America was doing. Things were happening in regards to that, in regards to other scandals and things happening in the government. Interestingly, one Vietnam veteran even writes this. Some of the searing impact of the Vietnam War on historical memory in the United States appeared in an essay called Ambush, published by a novelist, the Vietnam veteran Tim O'Brien, in 1993. The piece consisted of a series of passages on the fighting of April 19th, 1775, that would be Lexington and Concord, alternating with the author's highly personal memories of Vietnam. The parallels, O'Brien wrote, struck me as both obvious and telling. A civil war, a powerful world-class army blundering through an unfamiliar terrain, a myth of invincibility, immense resources of wealth and firepower that somehow never produced definitive results, as a sense of bewilderment and dislocation. This American identified mainly with the British regulars, the grunts of an earlier war. The downside, he added, in some deeply human way, I had more in common with those long-dead redcoats than with the living men and women all around me. I felt a member of a mysterious old brotherhood, a shared knowledge and shared terror. I could hear 700 pairs of boots on the roads. I could smell the sweat and fear. Somewhere inside me, Vietnam and Battle Road seemed to merge into a single ghostly blur across history, which is a sad account. And it is interesting that tables do turn a little bit in America being kind of an invading power force, and we do see some similarities in a few of these things. But it's interesting that there becomes this cycle, as I've been saying, that when there's kind of a down political time, we look at history through a pretty negative lens. And so so we're getting closer. Now we're kind of in our modern times. I'm not sure how many of you have read Rush Limbaugh's books. I have not actually read them either, but it's interesting that both of these are fairly modern books, but one's more from a kind of a revisionist history side, but also Rush Limbaugh's side definitely has an agenda as well, but one that probably more of us would align with. And it's interesting that even today, things have happened, and politically, things have gone in such a way that the people use historical accounts in various ways. So, but it's a very interesting thing here. As I wrap up, as this account, the dominant school of American historiography turned its attention from narratives of public events to analysis of intellectual systems and material structures, a change. So we're kind of looking at things in a different light. The result on the assumptions that individual actors in history are significant mainly as instruments of a larger process over which they have little control for a generation, for the generation of Vietnam and Watergate, those organizing these organizing ideas have become strong in American universities. So we start to see we're kind of again in a time of stripping away some of that luster of American patriotism. So just kind of to wrap up, for our subject, the new trends inevitably mean another turn of the wheels of the telling of history. Through 2 centuries, the myths of the Midnight Ride has been continuously reinvented by Americans in response to their changing circumstances. In every generation, we have been given a new Paul Revere. The injured innocence of the Whig propaganda, the ardent patriot of the New Republic, the historic loner of Longfellow's romantic poems, a man on horseback of the late 19th century, a man of solid substance of the American Anglophiles, the colonial clown of the debunkers, and the simple artisan of Esther Forbes, the capitalist Democrat of the Cold War, a patriot villain of the post-Vietnam iconoclasts, and the new age of global democracy, a leader of collective efforts in the cause of freedom. So it's interesting not to discourage you in your study of history, but it's good to remember that history gets accounted in unique ways at different times. And historical accounts and, in general, media has been used to move our thought process in one way or the other. It's interesting that if you think about it right now, once again, we are kind of in one of those downtimes, kind of a political depression, as it were, after seeing what's happened with Afghanistan, with Biden in the White House, those kind of things. It's interesting that we're probably going to see some more of those kind of negative tearing down of American values. So this isn't the first time it's happened, but it's right now, so it's what's very important to us. Also, it's interesting and it's good to be aware that media has a very big role in how we see the world. Interestingly, shows like is it coincidence that shows like 24, which has to do with terrorism and terrorist and responses, came out right around the time the Patriot Act came out. Things like that are interesting to note if you'd all watch those kind of things, that media tries to shift our worldview. And so it's good. I would encourage you guys, I know this has kind of been a long and hopefully it's been interesting and informative, but how history gets changed throughout time. So I would highly recommend going and finding good history books. Again, recommend this one, but find good history books, find good accounts of what happened, go back to original sources. If at all possible, maybe take a little time away from media and the television and that type of thing. Find some good books, find some original sources. Like Pastor said, we're going to put together some reading lists. And as you have maybe some time over the holidays or something else, get some good books, study some good history, and be aware as you get different books, even children's books and different things about history. Be aware that the people that write in their times and write with their agenda, and that it's something to be aware of. And hopefully that lays a decent foundation that we can kind of build off of and talk a little more about history and why it's important and why it's good to study. So appreciate your guys' time.